Welcome to a new episode of Atlantic Debrief, our social media interview show and podcast here at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center, where we discuss the latest issues and developments in transatlantic relations. In today's episode, we will focus on French President Emmanuel Macron's visit to the United States, his second state visit, the first state visit under the Biden administration. And to give us a preview of what's on the agenda and what we can expect from this state visit, we are delighted to welcome Georgina Wright, Senior Fellow and Director of the Europe Program at the Paris-based think tank Institut Montaigne. A warm welcome, Georgina.
Bonjour, Jörn.
To dive right in, maybe you can give us, before we get to the substantive agenda, just a quick update. This visit comes just over a year after the AUKUS falling out, where we saw a French-Australian submarine deal scrapped in favor of UK, US, Australia cooperation, which led to some real diplomatic tensions between Washington and Paris. There's been a real effort to patch up things since then. Is this state visit sort of the last step in making up between the United States and France? What are the trust levels? What's the general atmospherics in the relationship?
So I actually think the atmospherics are pretty good on the whole. If you think back, as you said, a year ago, it looked very, very different. And of course, AUKUS happened, but then you also had the US sort of leaving Afghanistan and a lot of allies feeling that they hadn't, been fully warned or could have prepared for that. And then, of course, you have the war in Ukraine, where France perhaps at the beginning had a slightly different approach and at least a different assessment of the risk of Russian invasion. So there are a number of things that have happened over the past year. And I think the fact that this is, President Biden's first state visit as president of the United States, the fact that France, French President Macron, it's his second state visit. So, President Trump invited him and now he's going back. I mean, the symbolism is really, really important, and it's not lost on France at all. They realize that this is, a willingness for France to show the United States that it considers it an important ally, and vice versa. And I think what we need to watch out for over the next coming days, because there's a really, really busy agenda, is what's going to come out of it. Will we have new, announcements around cooperation? I'm thinking of nuclear energy, for example, or space cooperation. Will they be doing more together in Africa and the Middle East? Because, of course, both the United States and France have recently published a strategic review, which kind of outlines their foreign policy priorities. So I think people are waiting to see, beyond the kind of the symbolism, beyond the photo opportunity, whether there is something substantive that will come out of it.
So a strong starting point, good symbolism, stronger relations since that incident more than a year ago. Can you expand a little bit? You already touched on some of the agenda points. We'll see a visit by President Macron to NASA headquarters with the Vice President Harris. What else? There are also some flashpoints in the relationship, especially on the economic and trade side of things. What are the priorities on the policy, on the substantive side for President Macron? What do you think we can expect?
So I think obviously most of it is bilateral work, but there is a European element to that, and we will come to it. I think on the bilateral work, it's quite interesting to see some of the visits and meetings he has. So he's meeting, of course, President Biden and his team, but he's meeting, Secretary Blinken, he's meeting Kamala Harris, the Vice President. So there are a number of things that they're going to be touching on. And if you look at the agenda, they talk about space cooperation, about nuclear. He's going to Congress to meet with the biodiversity group. And he's also traveling to Louisiana, the first French president to do so in 46 years, to, of course, kind of remember and sort of celebrate those historical ties between Louisiana and France, but also to talk about climate change and to see, I think, for himself, some of the impact the climate change has had in Louisiana and New Orleans. So it is much broader than simply talking about what we can do in Africa and in the Indo-Pacific. There is going to be another thing on the agenda, which I think we didn't think would be on the agenda back in September when the state visit was announced, and that's the Inflation Reduction Act, which of course the United States has passed, will come into full effect on the 1st of January, and which is creating real anxiety in Europe, because there is a sense that actually through the subsidies and sort of the tax credits, there are a number of European industries that are looking to kind of move some of their production in the United States to benefit from that regime. And at the time when Europe is trying to rebuild itself after COVID, and also to face the repercussions of the Ukraine war, there is a question of how can we reindustrialize if many of our key and very high-performing industries are thinking of moving to the US. And so Thierry Breton, who's the European European Commissioner for the Internal Market, said it was a strategic challenge, an existential challenge was actually the word that he used. So really, this is a serious concern, and I suspect that President Macron will want to talk to President Biden about it. But of course, there are limits to what he can say. He's not the president of Europe. He is a leader amongst 27. And of course, anything to do with trade policy or commercial policy is really the EU that leads on that, so Brussels. So I think if he does say anything, it will have to be with the approval of the European Commission and also the other member states.
President Macron, just coming back to that point on the Inflation Reduction Act and the potential competitiveness challenge to European manufacturing in particular, President Macron has spoken of sort of retaliatory moves on the trade front in terms of a Buy European Act. How do you think that will be received in Washington, D.C.? And do you think there is a sort of landing zone or some hope for consensus or a way forward there?
I'm the eternal optimist, but I'm not sure there's necessarily going to be consensus found. I think the reaction that you've really heard from the US has been, well, why don't you just have a similar subsidy regime? And then, why don't you support your industry in the way that we will support our green industry, because it is the industry of the future, etc. So the problem is for Europeans is that they already have, a huge investment plan that they launched after COVID to kind of relaunch the European economy. And there are already questions now about how do we pay back all that money. And so if we're now talking about another investment plan, different member states aren't very comfortable about that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is quite a few member states are worried that if the EU did kind of replicate in some way what the United States is doing, then we would be, heading towards more protectionism in general in the global trading system, and that's something actually that we shouldn't be encouraging at all. And then the third thing is, yes, you did hear at the beginning, well, maybe there will be a trade war or a subsidy war with the United States. I don't think anyone in the EU wants this right now, particularly given that the war in Ukraine, which is the geopolitical context, matters. The West wants to be united, and this isn't the time to be, having a trade war between, the two sort of big markets. So I don't think that's where we're heading. But the options for the EU, I mean, you've heard an advisor to President Macron yesterday say maybe the US could give us some exemptions, so that might make it easier for our companies that produce here solar panels, batteries, electric vehicles, that they can still continue to export to the US market and benefit from similar treatment. I think that's going to be very difficult, to be honest, to negotiate with the US, but we will see. But if that negotiation were to happen, I'm not sure President Macron has the competence to do that. It would have to be something the European Commission leads on.
Moving on to the Russia's war in Ukraine, President Macron has come sometimes under criticism in the United States, but also among some Central and Eastern Europeans for his outreach to President Putin and a continued dialogue at times. Where do you see his positioning and France's positioning on the conflict in Ukraine going, and how much of a subject will that be for the conversations with the U.S. administration?
I mean, I think it's going to be an important aspect of the bilateral conversation. And that's because at the very beginning, just before Russia invaded Ukraine, you clearly had the Germans and the French saying, we don't think an invasion is imminent, versus, the United States and the UK, amongst others, who were saying, no, actually an invasion is imminent. And then, of course, as you rightly point out, President Macron continues to talk to President Putin, although less than he did before. I think there's a view in France that is useful, that we should keep one diplomatic corridor open, but I don't think people are under any illusion that that's somehow going to change President Putin's approach to Ukraine, or change the war dramatically. But there is a sense, and President Macron has said this over and over again, when the war ends and that Ukraine is happy with the conditions that are attached to that, there will be a point where we will need to rebuild Ukraine, and we will need to think about how we engage Russia. And that's his whole thing about we must not humiliate Russia at the end of the war. What he meant was, once the war has ended and Ukraine is happy with conditions, because that is the most important thing, and only Ukraine can decide what those conditions look like, we're going to have to deal with Russia one way or another. So actually, in that way, it's quite helpful also to keep a corridor. And then on things like nuclear proliferation, protecting nuclear plants, also dealing with prisoners of war. Those are all things that it is useful. I think there's a view in the French government that it is useful to continue talking to Vladimir Putin. But you're right, it's a point of contention, and quite a number of member states, particularly the Baltic states and member states in Eastern Europe, say this is not how we should be dealing with Vladimir Putin. So we'll have to see if that changes. But certainly there is willingness, I think, for France to continue to engage the United States on this, because, and this has been said publicly, Europe is not at this point capable of facing Russia without the support of the United States. And so there are longer term questions of what Europe does to build its defense capabilities. But at the moment, we can't have that conversation. And I'll end by saying, in the National Strategic Review, it was very interesting how prominent NATO was throughout that strategic review, making absolutely clear the NATO bedrock of European collective security, and that NATO plays an important role overall in European defence.
Which had been a point of contention, as you put it, before, whenever President Macron would insist on European strategic autonomy and European defense capabilities, which we'll skip that part. We'll move to the last question on another sort of geopolitical great power competition perspective. What do you think we can expect from France and U.S.-French cooperation and Macron's posturing in the Indo-Pacific? Coming full circle from the start of our conversation, that was the flashpoint as France was stepping up in the Indo-Pacific with that deal with Australia. But there's also huge military cooperation. France has 1.5 million citizens in the Indo-Pacific region, and a military presence. Is that an area of opportunity, continues to be for U.S.-French cooperation?
I mean, potentially, France says, it is an Indo-Pacific power. It has territory in the Indo-Pacific. So obviously what happens in the Indo-Pacific is at the core of French national interest. I think, France continues to maintain that it wants to be in puissance d'équilibre, meaning a power of equilibrium. So
stabilizing,
not siding with either the United States or China in this rivalry. And the second thing that was again in this National Strategic Review was that it didn't want to get caught up in a logic of blocks, which again, without citing the United States and China directly, I think it was again sort of recalling or reminding that people that actually France wants to kind of keep equidistance. The problem is how can you sort of work on the Indo-Pacific with the United States in the Indo-Pacific if you don't have or closely align on China? Now, there are a number of things that you could do, and that's, protecting undersea cables, critical infrastructure. And in a way, that's what the United States and the UK and Australia have done through the AUKUS deal. It's not just about nuclear submarines, it's also about protecting undersea cables. And then that aspect France understands and wants to do more of. There's also a lot to do on climate change, improving the trade environment. So there are things where France and the United States can definitely work together. But the question, I think, on allies but not aligned on China, will remain a tricky conversation. And I can imagine, I wouldn't want to be in the room when that conversation happens between President Biden and President Macron. But, this is also the China discussion within the EU is also changing, because you have some member states who say, well, actually, if it's the price to pay to ensure that the US continues to provide, be a guarantor of European security, continues to be interesting in European security, maybe it's a price that's worth paying, that we align ourselves slightly more in the United States vis-a-vis China. Others completely disagree. So this is a sort of a tricky conversation between France and the US, but also within the EU.
Where do you think France is on that in that European comparison? We've just seen controversial visit by German Chancellor Scholz to Beijing, President Macron's statements about being that stabilizing actor, not wanting to get caught up in confrontation between two great powers. Where's France on the willingness to confront China, which many China hawks in DC will be looking for closely?
It's a really difficult question. I think France and the EU's language on China has hardened over the years, but there is this sense that on some things, you'll have to cooperate with China, whether it's dealing with climate change, reducing gas emissions. There are other things where China poses a systemic rival. So it really depends on what we're talking about. But I think there is a sense in Paris that, being overly dependent on any country is not a good idea. And so that question, of course, relates to China as it does to other countries. So I think it's slightly too early to say, but I wouldn't sort of expect a radical change, especially not overnight, in France's position towards China. But I would fully expect France to be very active in China discussions in Brussels, within the EU. But also we've seen the G7 talk much more about, not directly about China, but some of the issues of being overly dependent on China for critical materials or production. And I guess that discussion will continue, and we can fully expect France to be very invested in those discussions.
Thank you so much, Georgina. That's all the time we have today. We'll keep a close eye on President Macron's state visit to the United States this week. And thank you to our viewers for joining. Keep following us on social media, Twitter, YouTube, and elsewhere for more analysis from Atlantic Debrief at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. Thank you so much.